In this powerful story, a Queen's Guard breaks protocol in a moment that leaves everyone stunned when a 98-year-old D-Day veteran approaches during the ceremonial march. But what happens when generations of service meet on hallowed ground? Don't miss this incredible story of respect, legacy, and the enduring spirit of those who serve. Subscribe now and share where you're watching from to honor our veterans worldwide. The rhythmic thud of polished boots echoed through the cobblestone streets near Buckingham Palace. Tourists gathered along the barriers, their cameras poised, eagerly awaiting the ceremonial changing of the Queen's Guard. Amid the crowd, one figure stood out, not for his camera or posture, but for the weight of history etched into his bearing. Frank Morrison adjusted the lapel of his navy blazer where rows of medals gleamed under the afternoon sun. His white hair was neatly combed, his shoulders slightly stooped, but still bearing a soldier's pride. He gripped the handle of his cane with hands weathered by time and service. Each step he took was deliberate, not out of weakness, but out of reverence for the moment. For Frank, this wasn't just a tourist outing, it was a pilgrimage. He glanced over his shoulder at his granddaughter, Emma, who was struggling to keep up while balancing her phone and a map. "Granddad, wait up!" she called out, smiling as she finally reached him. "You're walking like you're late for deployment." "Management." Frank chuckled softly, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "If you knew what this place meant, you'd be hurrying too." His gaze swept over the scene, taking in the grandeur of the palace gates, the meticulous formations of the guards, and the murmurs of the excited crowd. He tightened his grip on the cane, the weight of the past settling over him. Back then, there wasn't time to stand around admiring the architecture, he said, almost to himself. This city was under siege, every street corner a reminder of what was at stake. Emma's expression softened as she stepped closer. She'd heard snippets of his stories before. The Normandy beaches, the long nights in makeshift barracks, the comrades he'd lost. But today she sensed there was more to his words. "I'm glad you're here to see it like this," she said. "Peaceful. Alive." Frank nodded, but didn't reply. His attention was drawn to the guards forming in their precise lines, their crimson coats vivid against the black gates. He could see the youngest among them, faces barely older than his own had been during the war. Their polished uniforms and immaculate posture mirrored the discipline he had once lived by. As the ceremony began, the crowd grew still. The sound of the military band filled the air, and the guards moved in perfect unison. But Frank's focus wasn't on the pageantry. It was on the young guard closest to the barrier, his stoic expression hiding the same fire Frank remembered in himself all those years ago. "Emma," Frank said, his voice quieter now. "That young lad, the one closest to us. Look at his eyes." Emma tilted her head, trying to follow her grandfather's line of sight. "He looks focused, I guess." "Focused," Frank repeated, "and burdened. You don't carry yourself like that unless you've got something to prove." Emma was about to respond when a push from the growing crowd nearly knocked Frank off balance. She grabbed his arm, steadying him as a murmur spread through the onlookers. "Sorry, mate," muttered a man in a Union Jack t-shirt, though his tone suggested he wasn't particularly sorry. Frank shook his head. "No harm done," he said, though the interruption had rattled him. He stepped closer to the barrier, as if drawn by an invisible force. His cane tapped lightly against the pavement with each step. "Granddad, you're getting too close," Emma whispered, eyeing the palace guards. "You're not supposed to—" Before she could finish, Frank had stopped near the edge of the cordoned area. He stood there, silently watching as the young guard executed a sharp turn, his expression unreadable. The two men locked eyes for a fleeting moment. The guard, Oliver Hart, hesitated, not enough to draw official notice, but just enough for Frank to see it. A recognition passed between them, brief but undeniable. Emma tugged at his arm. "Granddad, come back. You're going to get in trouble." Frank didn't move. "He reminds me of someone," he said softly. The ceremony continued without pause, but Oliver's gaze flickered back to Frank twice more before the end. Each time, his disciplined exterior betrayed the faintest hint of curiosity. As the guards marched off, Frank stepped back, letting Emma guide him to a quieter spot. "What was that about?" she asked. Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked down at his medals, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. "Sometimes you see yourself in someone, even if they're a stranger. That boy, he's carrying something, just like I was. Maybe today wasn't just about me remembering the past. Maybe it was about reminding him of the future." Emma didn't fully understand, but she nodded, sensing the depth of her grandfather's words. Behind them, the crowds began to disperse, but the moment between the veteran and the young guard lingered in the air, as if the weight of history itself had acknowledged them both. The murmurs of the dispersing crowd faded into the background as Frank and Emma moved further down the palace gates. Though the ceremony had ended, the impact of the moment still hung in the air. Frank's mind lingered on the young guard, Oliver, whose gaze had seemed to pierce through time. Emma, sensing her grandfather's preoccupation, remained quiet, though her curiosity simmered beneath the surface. "Granddad," she finally ventured, "what did you mean back there? About seeing yourself in him?" Frank paused mid-step, resting both hands on his cane. His blue eyes, sharp even at 98, met hers with a seriousness she rarely saw. "In war," he said quietly, "you learn to read people fast, sometimes faster than they'd like. That boy's eyes, they told a story, one I've lived." Before Emma could press further, a commotion broke out near the gates. A middle-aged man in a loud Hawaiian shirt was arguing with one of the palace guards stationed nearby. His voice, grating and boisterous, carried over the murmurs of the other tourists. "Come on, mate, just one picture," the man demanded, holding his phone up like a trophy. The guard remained statuesque, his gaze fixed forward, his stoic expression unwavering. The Hawaiian-shirted man waved a hand in front of the guard's face, grinning. "What, you're not allowed to smile? Not even for the camera?" A few in the crowd chuckled nervously, but most shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to intervene. Emma frowned. Some people just don't know when to stop. Frank, however, didn't move. His gaze was locked on the young guard from earlier, Oliver Birch, who was approaching the scene. His polished boots clapped sharply against the pavement as he stepped into position, his presence commanding without a single word. "Oi, here's another one," the man in the Hawaiian shirt exclaimed, pointing his phone at Oliver now. "Maybe you'll break character for a TikTok, yeah? Come on, give us a little wave." Oliver's jaw tightened, the only hint that he'd even registered the man's taunts. He remained silent, his posture impeccable, his rifle held firmly. Frank watched intently, his hand gripping his cane as if bracing for something unseen. "Leave him be," Frank said finally, his voice steady but firm. The man turned, clearly surprised. "What's it to you, old-timer?" Frank straightened as much as his frame would allow, his medals catching the light. "That lad is doing his duty, something you clearly don't understand." The man's smirk faltered as he glanced at the rows of medals adorning Frank's blazer. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd, several tourists now pulling out their phones to capture the unfolding scene. Emma stepped closer to her grandfather, her heart pounding. "Granddad, maybe we should—" Frank raised a hand, silencing her. His eyes never left the man. "During the war," he continued, his voice rising just enough to carry over the onlookers, "men like him stood watch while the rest of us fought. They didn't flinch, didn't falter. And because of that, people like you have the freedom to act the fool without consequence. But not here. Not on their time." A hush fell over the crowd. Even the man in the Hawaiian shirt seemed momentarily at a loss for words. He opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, Oliver spoke. "Sir," the young guard said, his tone measured but firm, "please step back behind the barriers." He turned. It wasn't just the words but the authority behind them that made the man comply. He took a step back, muttering under his breath, but the tension in his posture suggested he'd been chastened. The crowd began to clap, their applause growing louder as Frank tipped his head respectfully toward Oliver. The young guard's eyes flicked briefly toward Frank, gratitude and admiration flashing across his face before his professional mask returned. He resumed his post, but the connection between the two men remained palpable. Emma tugged gently on Frank's sleeve. "That was something," she whispered. Frank exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the battles worth fighting don't need weapons." As the crowd began to disperse once more, Frank and Emma started to walk away, but Oliver's voice stopped them. "Sir?" he called out, stepping just close enough to be heard without breaking protocol. "Thank you for everything." The text clicked and popped, cautionary letters with check marks. Frank turned, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, slowly, he raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate salute. Oliver hesitated, then returned the gesture, his movements precise and reverent. As they walked away, Emma glanced up at her grandfather, her voice quiet but insistent. "You made an impression, didn't you?" Frank smiled faintly. "He reminded me of the lads I served with, young, brave, and carrying more than their fair share of the world. If a few words from an old man can lighten that load, it's worth the effort." Emma didn't reply, but she slipped her arm through his, walking a little closer as the weight of the moment settled between them. Behind them, the palace gates stood tall and unyielding, but, for Frank, it wasn't the grandeur of the setting that mattered. It was the quiet, unspoken connection between two soldiers, one past, one present, that carried the true weight of the day. The walk back to the quiet seating area near the palace gardens was slow but purposeful. Frank's steps were steadier now, as though the moment with the young guard had reignited something within him. Emma, still absorbing the tension and dignity of what had just transpired, struggled to put her thoughts into words. She settled for silence, letting her grandfather lead the way. As they reached a bench overlooking the vast green lawn, Frank lowered himself onto the seat with a soft groan, the weight of his years briefly catching up to him. Emma sat beside him, her curiosity finally breaking through. "Granddad," she began, her voice tentative, "that guard. You really saw yourself in him, didn't you?" Frank didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the curved handle of his cane, his gaze fixed on a spot far beyond the gardens. For a moment Emma thought he hadn't heard her, but then he nodded, his expression pensive. "It's not something I can explain easily," he said at last, his voice low but steady. "It's a feeling you get when you've been in the thick of it. War, I mean. You learn to see the weight people carry, even if they don't speak a word." Emma tilted her head, watching him closely. "Do you think he's been through something?" Frank nodded again, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Could be. Or maybe he's just bracing himself for what's ahead. Either way, I saw the same fire in his eyes that I had when I was his age, the same determination to stand tall, even when the world's pressing down on you." Emma frowned. "But isn't he just doing his job? I mean, it's not like he's in a war." Frank chuckled softly, though the sound carried a hint of sadness. "Every man faces his own battles, Emma. Some you can see, and some you can't. A uniform doesn't always tell you where those battles have been fought, or where they'll take you." Before Emma could reply, a soft voice interrupted them. "Excuse me, sir." Both Frank and Emma turned to see Oliver standing a respectful distance away, his crimson coat impeccable, and his rifle still held with the precision of his training. He had removed his bearskin hat, tucking it under one arm, which made him look younger than he had appeared on duty. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," Oliver said, his tone polite but carrying an undercurrent of something deeper. "I just wanted to say thank you for what you said earlier." Frank regarded him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gestured to the space beside him. "Come, lad. Sit for a moment." Oliver hesitated, glancing around as though worried someone might see him. Emma spoke up, her tone gentle. "It's okay. We won't tell anyone." With a small nod, Oliver took the offered seat, perching stiffly on the edge of the bench. Up close, Emma could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested carefully on his knees as though still bracing for inspection. "Frau Leiner," Frank broke the silence. "You're not from around here, are you?" I shook my head wonderingly. Oliver shook his head. "No, sir. I grew up in Manchester, joined the army when I was 18. "And now you're part of the Queen's Guard," Frank said, his tone appraising. "That's no small accomplishment." "It's an honor, sir," Oliver replied, though his voice wavered slightly. "But it's a lot to carry sometimes." Frank nodded knowingly. "It always is, son. Service asks more of us than most will ever understand. But that's why we do it, isn't it?" Oliver glanced at Frank, something shifting in his expression. "Did you serve, sir?" Frank's fingers brushed over the medals on his blazer, his voice softening. "Day. Normandy. I was barely older than you are now, when they sent me across that channel." Oliver's eyes widened slightly, his posture straightening. "Day?" he echoed, his voice tinged with awe. "I've read about it in training, but meeting someone who was actually there?" Frank gave a small, wry smile. "It was a lifetime ago, lad, but some things never leave you. The faces, the sounds, the weight of knowing every step forward might be your last. Those memories, they don't fade." For a moment, neither man spoke. Emma watched the exchange, the gravity of her grandfather's words settling over her. Oliver finally broke the silence. "Mr. Oliver," Emma told the colonel thoughtfully as she moved to the bedside table and picked up the violets. "My grandfather served too," he said quietly. "Korea. He used to talk about the same things, the weight, the memories. I think that's why I joined, to carry on what he started." Frank's smile widened just slightly, his eyes glinting with pride. "Then you're doing him proud, son. Don't ever doubt that." Oliver hesitated, then extended his hand. "Thank you, sir, for everything." Frank took the offered hand, his grip firm despite his years. The handshake lingered for a moment longer than expected, an unspoken connection passing between the two men. When Oliver stood to leave, he replaced his hat with careful precision, his movements once again those of a disciplined soldier. As he walked back toward the gates, Emma turned to her grandfather. "He'll remember that, won't he?" Frank leaned back on the bench, his eyes following the young guard's retreating figure. "A soldier never forgets the ones who remind him why he serves." The gentle hum of the departing crowd outside Buckingham Palace had been replaced by a calmer, quieter energy. Tourists had drifted to nearby parks or cafes, while the last few lingered at the gates, snapping photos of the guards returning to their posts. Frank and Emma remained seated on the bench, the weight of their earlier conversation still hanging between them. It wasn't long before a new ripple of attention swept through the dwindling crowd. A well-dressed man in a dark suit wearing a discreet earpiece approached the bench with a purposeful stride. Emma noticed him first and nudged her grandfather gently. "Granddad, I think someone's coming to see you," she said, her voice tinged with curiosity. Frank straightened, his hand instinctively brushing his blazer, an old habit of preparation. The man stopped a few feet away and gave a polite nod. "Mr. Morrison, is it?" Frank's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. "Yes, that's me." "My name is James Collins," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm with the Royal Household Staff. I hope I'm not interrupting." Frank shook his hand, still unsure of the man's purpose. "Not at all. What can I do for you?" Collins smiled warmly. "We noticed your presence during the ceremony, sir, and one of our guards mentioned your words earlier. On behalf of the palace, I'd like to thank you for the respect and dignity you showed during what could have been an uncomfortable situation." Frank blinked, surprised. "I was only speaking the truth. That young lad was doing his duty, and it didn't go unnoticed," Collins replied. "We would like to extend an invitation for you to watch the next ceremony from a reserved seating area." It's a small token of appreciation for your service and your visit today." Emma's eyes widened. "That's amazing. Granddad, you should do it." Frank hesitated, glancing down at his cane. "I appreciate the offer, but I didn't come here for special treatment. I just wanted to see the ceremony and pay my respects." Colin's expression softened. "That humility is exactly why we'd be honored to have you, sir. If you change your mind, please let us know." He handed Emma a small card with a phone number. "And if you don't mind, I'd also like to arrange for someone to escort you and your granddaughter to a more comfortable location for the rest of the day." Frank opened his mouth to decline, but Emma interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "Granddad, let them. You've earned this." After a moment, Frank nodded reluctantly. "All right, lad. Thank you." As Collins departed, Emma couldn't hide her excitement. "Granddad, do you realize how rare this is? They noticed you. The guards, the palace staff. They saw who you are." Frank chuckled softly. "I'm not sure it's about who I am. It's about what we stand for, Emma. Sometimes people need a reminder that respect isn't just for tradition. It's for the people behind it." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of clapping. At first it seemed distant, but it quickly grew louder. Emma turned toward the gates, where a group of onlookers had begun applauding. The ripple of recognition spread as more people joined in. Some pointed at Frank, others at Oliver, who had returned to his position but stood with a faint smile, his eyes flicking toward the bench where Frank sat. Frank shifted uncomfortably, unused to being the center of attention. "What's all this about?" Emma beamed. "They're clapping for you, Granddad, for what you said, for who you are." Frank shook his head. "No, lass, they're clapping for what we all stand for, those who served and those who still do." The applause grew louder, and Frank, unable to ignore the crowd's energy, finally stood. Using his cane for support, he raised a hand in a modest wave. The crowd erupted into cheers, some even shouting words of gratitude. "Thank you, sir. God bless you. A real hero." Emma felt tears prick her eyes as she watched her grandfather, a man who rarely spoke of his wartime experiences, bask in a moment of well-deserved recognition. Beside the gate, Oliver broke protocol again, this time with a deliberate, formal salute aimed directly at Frank. It was a small gesture, but one that carried immense weight. Frank responded in kind, his hand steady as he returned the salute. The two men locked eyes once more, the connection between them stronger than ever. As the applause began to die down, an older man in the crowd stepped forward. His own military medals glinted in the sunlight as he approached Frank, his hand outstretched. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you. Men like you paved the way for men like me." Frank took his hand, shaking it firmly. "It's a road we all walk together, son. Never forget that." The man nodded, his eyes shining before stepping back into the crowd. Emma placed a hand on her grandfather's arm. "That was beautiful, Granddad." Frank smiled, his expression soft but resolute. "It's not about me, Emma. It's about the legacy. The sacrifices we made, the lessons we learned. They're not just memories. They're promises. Promises to the ones who come after us." As they returned to the bench, the applause fading into murmurs, Frank felt a renewed sense of purpose. He hadn't expected this trip to Buckingham Palace to be more than a nostalgic visit, but it had become something far greater, a reminder that respect, courage, and connection were as timeless as the soldiers who embodied them. The setting sun cast a golden hue over Buckingham Palace, painting the gates and the surrounding grounds in warm light. The applause had faded, the crowd dispersed, and the area now felt calmer, more serene. Frank and Emma lingered near the gardens, savoring the quiet moment. The air carried a sense of completion, like a chapter had been closed, not just for the day, but for something much deeper in Frank's life. The process of getting to know people. Frank sat back on the bench, his cane resting across his lap, his eyes gazing far beyond the well-manicured hedges. Emma, seated beside him, fiddled with the small card the palace staff had given her earlier. She had seen her grandfather in a new light today, a man whose service, often unspoken, had shaped not just him but everyone around him. "You okay, Granddad?" she asked softly. Frank turned to her, his weathered face breaking into a small smile. "Better than okay, lass. Today reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in a long time." "What's that?" He shifted slightly, his gaze drifting back toward the palace gates. "When you're young and serving, you're too busy surviving to think about the bigger picture. You're just doing your duty day in and day out. But when you get older, you start to wonder if it all meant anything." "If people remember." Emma frowned, her brow furrowing. "Of course people remember. Look at what happened today. That young guard, Oliver. He'll never forget meeting you, and neither will anyone in that crowd." Frank nodded, but there was a weight in his eyes. "It's not about remembering me, Emma. It's about remembering why we did what we did, why we served, why we sacrificed. Seeing Oliver today, it reminded me that the legacy isn't just in history books or parades. It's in the lives of those who come after us, carrying on the values we fought for." Emma reached out, resting a hand on his. "And you reminded him of that today, Granddad. You gave him something to carry forward." Frank chuckled softly, his gaze softening. "Maybe. But I think he gave me just as much. That lad, he's got his whole life ahead of him. And seeing him stand there, so steadfast and proud, it gave me hope. Hope that what we did still matters." Emma smiled, squeezing his hand. "It definitely matters." The sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Turning, they saw Oliver once again, this time without his ceremonial coat or rifle. He looked almost unrecognizable in his casual uniform, the weight of protocol visibly lifted from his posture. He carried a small envelope in his hand, his expression a mixture of respect and shyness. "Mr. Morrison," Oliver said, stopping a few feet away, "I hope I'm not intruding." Frank smiled warmly. "Not at all, lad. What brings you back?" Oliver held out the envelope. "The palace staff asked me to deliver this to you. It's an official letter of thanks for your service and for the moment you shared with us today." Frank took the envelope, his fingers trembling slightly. He studied the seal for a moment before tucking it carefully into his blazer pocket. "Thank you, son. That means more than you know." Oliver hesitated and stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly. "Sir, if it's all right, I wanted to say something." "Go on," Frank said, leaning forward slightly. "I joined the Guard because I wanted to serve my country, like my grandfather did," Oliver began, his tone steady but emotional. "But sometimes it's hard to remember why we do what we do. Seeing you today, hearing what you said, it reminded me. It reminded me that what we do isn't just about standing still or following orders. It's about carrying something bigger than ourselves." Frank's eyes glistened, and he reached out to place a hand on Oliver's shoulder. "You're right, lad. It's always about something bigger. Never forget that." Oliver nodded, his expression resolute. "I won't, sir." As the young guard straightened and stepped back, he saluted once more. This time it was not the rigid salute of duty, but one filled with profound respect and gratitude. Frank returned it, his movements slow but deliberate. Day 19, Empire Naval Aviation. After Oliver departed, Emma turned to her grandfather. "He's right, you know. You reminded him why he serves. That's something not many people could do." Frank exhaled, his shoulders relaxing. "I didn't do anything extraordinary, Emma. I just shared a moment. Sometimes that's all it takes to keep the fire burning." The two sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the city blending into the peacefulness of the gardens. Frank watched the palace gates as the guards resumed their posts, their movements precise and unyielding. He felt a deep sense of peace, as though a burden he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the lawn, Emma stood and stretched. "Come on, Grandad, let's get you back to the hotel. You've had a big day." Frank chuckled, using his cane to push himself to his feet. "A big day indeed. But a good one, lass, a good one." As they walked away, Frank glanced back one last time at the palace, the young guards, and the city that had borne witness to so much history. He knew he might never return, but that didn't matter. Today had been enough. Today he'd found a connection, a purpose, and a reminder that the values he'd fought for still lived on in the hearts of the next generation. And that, he thought with a quiet smile, was more than enough.